All right, thank you all very much for coming. As you're aware, we have a Freedom Gates project that was started last summer, and Brandon Eyersman and Alex Smith have continued that work in the fall, through the winter, and now into the spring. There was a presentation made a few weeks ago at an expo on undergraduate research, in which Brandon gave a brief presentation. So I thought it would be a good idea to have more time available, and also to have Alex Smith, who is the co-researcher on this project. And so I'm not going to say a great deal because I know they are very well prepared, and after their presentation we will ask some questions. All right, so over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Brandon Eyersman.
Hi, I'm Alex Smith.
And we're going to start off with this little symbol here. This is the Sankofa bird, a mythical symbol of the Akan people of Ghana. And it represents reaching back and fetching. Indeed, the need to reflect on our past in order to build a successful future is the central theme of the Freedom Gates project. The Freedom Gates refers to the opening and closing of the opportunities for peaceful and democratic systems, the opportunities for peaceful resolution of conflicts, the building of democratic systems, and the minimization of corruption. After multiple efforts to strengthen democracy in Africa, patrimonial autocracy still characterizes many governments there. And the building of peace and democracy in Liberia represents a significant achievement and an excellent opportunity to study how we can keep those gates open. So our research question in this project was, what lessons about peace and democracy can be learned from the Liberian experience and the 3 decades of Carter Center engagement there? Liberia in the late 80s and early 90s was characterized by civil war, ethnic factionalization, and humanitarian crisis. And Liberia in 2017 had a free and fair election resulting in the election of George Weah and a peaceful transfer of power. So the question remains, how did we get here? How did we get from that state not too long ago of general strife in the country to a state now where there's a lot more optimism? We believe that the lessons can be learned by studying the role of the Carter Center, an NGO that has had a continuing presence there in Liberia for more than 30 years. The hope is that with this research we can build a model of how countries can keep freedom's gates open. So oftentimes when talking about these sort of events, we say history is written by the victors, but sometimes when saying that, critical perspectives can be left out of the scenario, of the equation. There are not many writings available on the Liberian situation, but Alex and I had access to a yet untold perspective, that of the Carter Center. Using Professor Joseph's personal files from his time working at the Carter Center in the early 90s and certain documents received from Carter Center officials, we were able to construct this untold narrative. These primary documents included daily memos and sit-reps, correspondences between VIPs including Charles Taylor, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and others, Project Liberia planning documents, and outside analyses from various organizations. So the Freedom Gates project as a whole has also involved interviews with various scholars, bringing notables to campus, and 2 visits to the Carter Center in Atlanta to meet with officials.
Yeah, and I know that I'm working with these documents. It is quite the experience to be able to have sometimes really day-by-day reports about what's going on in Liberia by members of the Carter Center. Really to be able to be immersed in the context of the Liberian Civil War and the extensive peace-building efforts of the Carter Center. The documents are really a valuable resource, and it's been a pleasure for us to work with them.
So we're going to give you a little bit of background on the Carter Center and the Liberian situation in my presentation at the expo. Didn't have too much time, so we're going to go a little bit more in depth than I did at that presentation, just into what happened and who was there. So the Carter Center is our lens to look at this conflict through. The Carter Center is Jimmy Carter's NGO, founded in 1982, with the mission of waging peace, fighting disease, and building hope in the world. And so the African Governance Program took up this challenge in Liberia of restoring the peace after the Civil War began in 1989. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Liberia to start out with, and then we'll go through what happened during the war, and we'll go into what we found. So America has been connected to Liberia perhaps closer than any other country. Liberia was founded in the early 19th century by freed American slaves, and these Americo-Liberians dominated the government up until 1980. So there was just but a small ethnic minority in the country, and so this bred a lot of resentment because there was this small group dominating the government for so many years. So this long-brewing resentment from these diverse indigenous groups that are in Liberia boiled over in 1980 when Samuel Doe, a master sergeant in the armed forces of Liberia, invaded the presidential palace and assassinated sitting President William R. Tolbert Jr., seizing his place as head of state. This was seen by many as an opportunity for an equal representation amongst all Liberians, but instead his government was characterized by more ethnic factionalization and domination by his Kron indigenous group. So he adopted a pro-United States posture. The outgoing Carter administration and the incoming Reagan administration reaffirmed their traditional United States-Liberia relationship, and so initially there was a lot of hope that this could lead to a more equitable system in the future. But his major problems were domestic in nature, and unfortunately his inclusionary promise fell far short of expectations. He had established a parochial and aloof government surrounding himself with members of his own Kron people, like I said, and this led to many of the same complaints and resentments that plagued the Americo-Liberians regime before this period of time. So in 1989, the Liberian Civil War began with the invasion of Charles Taylor's NPFL, and thus began the 3 decades of work towards building peace that we have now.
Yeah. I'd say it's important to take note of where Liberia starts in terms of our research. We enter into a civil war which has arisen after the toppling of a long-standing minority government in which there are numerous factions fighting amongst themselves, and it seems like a dismal prospect. Something that needs to be noted is that the Carter Center's involvement wasn't just for a few years, it was over decades. And that really is necessary when a situation seems as dire as Liberia's was. It's important to maintain hope that over a long commitment, progress can be made. And that's something that the Carter Center really does show, as we'll go on to note. But just that background is important to keep in mind.
So that Civil War lasted until 1997 with the election of Charles Taylor as the president. And so the themes that emerged from this period, one is the push for elections. At every point along the process, with all the Carter Center officials' discussions with these leaders, they were on the most part saying we want elections and we want to have an elected leader. And obviously they care who it is, but the important part is having the elections, and they would accept the results. That was the main theme that came out of all the documents that we saw. The other theme was ethnic factionalization. Many of the warring parties were divided along ethnic lines, if not the vast majority of those. And so that represented a big roadblock in building peace and democracy, is overcoming those ethnic divisions that are so hard and so intrinsic. So Liberia today is an electoral democracy with George Weah as president, and so that represents quite the achievement from starting at the Civil War period. So we're going to go a little bit into the role of the Carter Center in Liberia during that time. So the most important and the most notable facet of the involvement there is Jimmy Carter's relationship with Liberia and his role as a conduit between the heads of each of the parties, and in particular Charles Taylor. Do you want to say something about Charles Taylor? Sure.
Well, Charles Taylor was a warlord in Liberia who led the largest faction, the NPFL, which controlled for much of the war, controlled a large proportion of Liberia's territory. He was really, just from the notes, kind of despised by a lot of other leaders in that conflict. And Jimmy Carter was the only real leader who had a connection with him, and who Charles Taylor would go out of his way to speak with. Jimmy Carter's role here is very important. The Carter Center derived a lot of its authority and legitimacy from him, a former US president, as a figurehead. His connections allowed groups that he spoke with to perceive him as someone who could get something done. Speaking with him provided legitimacy. He was able to establish a rapport. He really had a charisma that could bring together people who otherwise would not have liked to meet. And so really, Jimmy Carter's, of course, the Carter Center as a whole is essential to all of this, but Jimmy Carter really plays the critical role as the point person in bringing together a lot of disparate leaders.
And moving forward, the elections were always seen as a way to stamp an end to a conflict, or a stepping stone, a very essential stepping stone in finishing the conflict and bringing about peace. Whereas elections, that was much of the correspondence was saying, this is when we want to have elections, this is how we want to do it, we have to learn how to do it right. And so the Carter Center, one of the most important things the Carter Center did was being at every stage of the process of the consolidation of elections, from building that civil society that was needed to produce the elections, and monitoring the elections during, and making sure that those elections resulted in free and fair consequences. So once again, the consolidation of civil society represented a large part of the Carter Center's efforts. The Carter Center teamed up with other organizations in that as well. And also the holding of conferences and peace meetings was a big part of the Carter Center. Like we've been saying, they served as a conduit to each of the parties that was respected and that could bring together parties that were in very strong conflict together.
Yeah, and something important to note is that this conflict does not involve, say, 5 different factions that started at the beginning and went all the way through. There were factions that entered into the conflict, say, immediately after some other peace accord was made. That complicates the effort because now there's a group that, say, wasn't involved in the peace process, but that is now entered into the conflict. And so there's really an ongoing involvement among many different factions that come and go. And the Carter Center's role as a contiguous actor throughout all of that period really plays a critical function there.
So we're going to go into just a couple initiatives that the Carter Center had in Liberia during this time that really understate their role there. The first is the Organizational Development Workshop. This shows, let's see, let me get to my notes here. So this shows the role an experienced NGO can play in the consolidation of civil society. This meeting in 1992, February 9th through 11th, 1992, brought together the various leaders in Liberia and formed the Liberian Network for Peace and Development, an organization of Liberians that provided a critical role in elections observation. So that represents a significant achievement in the consolidation of civil society by bringing together Liberians to work for things that Liberia needs. Our second one here is Liberia 1994 Towards a Lasting Solution, also entitled CAPS 1, the beginning of the CAPS series. So this took an important step to address the lack of clear communications between the parties. Like we said, these groups, there was a lot of different groups that popped in and out, and oftentimes communication was made more difficult by the fact that those ethnic divisions were so sewn in as to lead to a deep distrust between the parties. But in 1994, the Carter Center had this initiative that brought together many of the leaders of the warring factions to have this meeting. And this played a large role in moving towards elections. And the third we have here is the visit of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was a renowned leader in the fight against apartheid and the 1984 Nobel Prize laureate. So this bringing of a religious leader to Liberia to call for peace brought a common narrative to each of a common narrative to the story, where each of the leaders and each of the parties could agree upon this leader is calling for peace.
Yeah, and just to note, there are 2 really different kinds of conferences or workshops that can be had. There's one that brings together civil society groups, and there's one that brings together leaders of the different factions of the parties. And both of those serve critical functions. The Carter Center was heavily involved in organizing both. Just as an example of the power of organizing civil society groups, Liberian civil society groups, many of them emerged during the war. There was not much communication and organization between them, the Carter Center was able to find a way to bring all of those groups together so they could coordinate their efforts. Other instances where they brought together, say, leaders of different communities across Liberia, who then were able to take further initiative on their own to try to do conflict mediation, and really have a group of just prominent Liberians working for peace in addition to NGOs. And then, of course, there's the obviously beneficial function of bringing together leaders of different warring factions and governmental organizations to negotiate and create channels of communication. And really, the visit of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, that came at a very important juncture when things were kind of on a precipice, and really was able to kind of put some electricity into into efforts to bring people together again and really fire up the average people of Liberia who had been suffering in this conflict so long.
This is perhaps the most exportable and of any of the Carter Center initiatives. Not every NGO is going to have someone like Jimmy Carter, who is internationally respected and who can talk to anyone. But one thing an NGO can do in this sort of conflict is bring members of the country or region that is in conflict together. The contiguity of the Carter Center there in Liberia represented something where international and unbiased group that all parties could communicate with. And so an NGO like the Carter Center has an opportunity to be that and bring together parties that would possibly not have such communication otherwise. So, key takeaways from our research here. We've discovered how an international NGO can play a role in attaining peace and democracy in a very divided country. The struggle for peace is a long one, and this research elucidates how an outside organization can help a country take steps towards that peace. Peace is not simply decided by the leaders of those warring factions at one point in the conflict. They all get together and say, okay, it's time for peace. It's fought for by every member of that country from the very beginning to way past any sort of end of the conflict or end of or elections. So, but we've found how an NGO like the Carter Center can help a country take steps towards that peace.
Yeah, and I'd like to make a few notes. One is an analogy. So if you take a country and say it's a pot of water, and a war is as a flame underneath the pot, and if the war goes long enough and the pot starts to boil, you can take away the war and take away, say, the flame and the source of the heat, but the pot will still be boiling. And it takes a long time for that pot to calm down to the point where it was before, where it's still water. And so this is kind of elucidating the necessity of maintaining involvement after a conflict has finished, after the documents have been signed and the formal peace has been declared, maintaining commitments through the democratic period, staying after election to monitor those and provide advice, right? And the Carter Center really embodied that role, right? Not just helping during the war, but staying involved up until today. Yeah, I would say that's really a key takeaway here, is that peace can be accomplished and progress can be made in the most dire situations over long periods of time with sustained commitment. And when people think of NGOs, they often think of people providing, say, humanitarian aid or other, say, really particular benefits and services in despairing regions. But there is also a larger role for NGOs to play. The Carter Center, in particular, came in to a position which no international government wanted to fill. In the lack of that leadership, the Carter Center really took on the leading role in providing efforts to mediate this conflict and sustained it over long periods of time. So there is a large space that can be filled, not just by governments, but by neutral actors with legitimate figureheads and legitimate leadership that can bring a lot of good to the world. And I think that's important for us to remember.
So there are some lasting questions that we are left with after our research. The first is this lasting in Liberia? There's a lot of optimism. The 2017 election represented a peaceful transfer of power from one democratically elected leader to the next. And hopefully George Weah will deliver on his promises for to work towards this model democracy that we all hope Liberia will attain. The second question is this exportable? There are many countries that are in conflict in the world, and there are many countries that the Carter Center is involved in. So the question remains, do we take these lessons from Liberia and apply them to other countries? I received a very good question at my expo presentation, and that is what lessons from the Carter Center can be applied to other countries. So we've gone over this, but once again, I think the most important thing that we've learned is that continued, sustained, and immersive engagement in a country can really make the best difference, where an NGO or an organization is there for the long haul. They're there from the beginning, past the point of the conflict ends through. And also immersive engagement. And one thing that the Carter Center in Liberia represented was the Carter Center was on the ground there. They were not simply here in America keeping up, they were in Monrovia conducting operations.
Yeah. Solving deep problems requires deep commitments, and doing so, even when it seems like the prospects for success are small, can, over long periods of time, make a difference.
And so I want to finish up with a quote from Professor Joseph that I think really encapsulates our whole project. The origin of the name Liberia is obvious. It is associated with the search for liberty of Africans subjected to the slave trade and slavery. It is appropriate that a comprehensive project on the opening and closing of freedom's gates in Africa should make its major focus country Liberia. If Liberia can keep open and widen the doors of liberty, what a powerful message that achievement will send to the rest of Africa and indeed the world. Thank you.
Okay, all right, thank you all very much. And in fact, you could take a seat because we're going to get the yeah, thank you so very much. And I'm so glad that we're able to record this presentation, because they are summarizing quite a body of research and thinking, between themselves. But I wanted to just add some remarks which would continue some of the points they made, as well as others that came to my mind as they were speaking. The first one was a comment that the work done so far is seen through the lens of the Carter Center. And as we think of this project going on, the idea of bringing in other lenses, I think is something to think about, as we consider some of the consultation. The second point was the use of the term dismal prospect, because certainly at the time I got involved in Liberia, my first visit was in 1990, and so for the early 1990s, and then continuing after that for a number of years, it did seem quite dismal. How is this country going to get out of what another research assistant who worked last summer called complicating violence? The violence just kept getting more and more complicated, different factions emerging. But it also triggered in my mind my use of the term dismal in a Nigerian context, because I have an article I wrote when Nigeria was very much mired under military rule in the 1980s and 1990s, and I called it the dismal tunnel. I was quoting a Nigerian leader to that effect, but it very much felt like this country had entered this tunnel. How is it going to get out of it? Some other points. You mentioned about the conferences, and I think that is going to be so important because there were so many different kinds of meetings taking place. And I think it was important to point out meetings among the warring groups and especially the leaders, but also the increasing role of the Carter Center in terms of civil society and meetings, and you mentioned some of the conferences in civil society. But another dimension that came to my mind listening to you was also the role that the Carter Center played in encouraging dialogue between some of these warring leaders and members of civil society who felt, this is our country and these guys are the ones tearing it apart. But anyway, I think that's also a dimension to think about. Another question that comes to mind is to what extent all that took place during the war, right? A lot of it was geared towards trying to bring an end to the conflict. And of course, as you mentioned, the election being seen as the gateway for bringing this about. But a question that I think we can take up as the project goes forward, and especially as we engage in conversations with Liberians, is what were the seeds sown during that period that could help Liberians as they move forward, right? Because if you're, one of the persons I quoted in one of the documents I wrote, where she said, she's an NGO leader, said, remember our past, right? So the extent to which, having gone through that experience, Liberians themselves have really internalized what it really meant. This incredible, catastrophe they went through. And even some, mechanisms of being able to bridge some of the divide. So this is just an idea. And of course, when we saw the recent elections, the way in which, if you contrast it with Kenya, right? When in Kenya, the systems didn't work, right? In the case of the Liberia, was the reverse, okay? One sort of counterfactual that came into my mind, especially considering the important role that the Carter Center played, and you mentioned this perhaps more in your earlier presentation than this one, was the fact that the United States, abstained from what would have been anticipated, given its historical relationship, and given the small size of Liberia and so on. And you can contrast it with what the Brits, Britain did with regard to the conflict in Sierra Leone. And so the Carter Center, almost by default, part of it was, Jimmy Carter and so on, but by default, that the United States, apart from humanitarian agencies and so on, and obviously the diplomatic services, but the United States, in terms of what it can actually bring to, trying to terminate one of these countries, was quite absent. And so the counterfactual that came to my mind was, what would have happened in Liberia if the Carter Center was not involved? If you try to think of taking the Carter Center out of the process, and especially seeing how really unsuccessful the ECOMOG, the regional force, were. They accomplished a lot, but they became very much implicated in the conflict, divisions among themselves, and so on. But anyway, it's something to really think about, of understanding that important role. You mentioned, and this is something that I think is very critical as we try to understand, just some of the things that are different about the Carter Center, and is the way in which the Carter Center's sense of itself and its involvement in these conflict situations underwent a change, all right, over time. And so the words that come to us that you've used, being very immersive, obviously collaborative. That's a very important part of the modus operandi of Carter and the people who work with him. But the sustained nature of that involvement, very, very unique for the Carter Center involvement in peace and democracy exercises in the continent. You can contrast that with the health field, the disease eradication field, where there was no sense, we're going to come in here, we're going to fix this, or we're going to be out, all right? They might have thought so in terms of guinea worm eradication and others, but they recognize that you're in there to deal with these issues, you're there for the long haul. So this was something that I think was transformative about the Carter Center itself, that it had to become not only sustained, but that its involvement acquired such both depth and breadth over time. The last point is this metaphor that Alex used. Alex is always going to come up with a fine turn of words, we've known that. But the idea of boiling water and the heat that's generating that boiling function. When I think of, I apply that to Liberia, is the fact that Liberia had decades of these very deep inequities. You mentioned that, minority government and so on, over a long period. Samuel Doe coming to power in 1980 was a reflection of some of that underlying, those underlying grievances. All right, then a decade later, a decade after 1990, the country goes into this warfare, and then complicating warfare. Right? And so now, it's really boiling. Now, it has come out of that situation, but it has come out of that situation of this wartime experience, but what was causing Liberia to be such an unsettled place still remains, right? And so when we think of the country going forward, it's not only the wartime experience, but also you really have these long decades of a sense of injustice and certainly, political and economic. All right? So let me stop there and give you all a chance, to ask some questions and, direct your questions to the speakers of the day.
Two questions. One is the nature of the sources you were kind of gathering your information from. It's like, is it archival in a way? Letters written, declarations made, agreement is signed in the Carter administration. The second is the nature of the Carter intervention in Liberia. It seems very laudable job. I mean, Liberia has kind of has been like a very promising path to electoral democracy in a way. That seems really good, and you guys really kind of clarify the extent to which the Carter administration has, produced the result in a way. Was that all the Carter administration's intervention essential to strengthen civil society and kick off the electoral process and consolidate democracy? Or was it also engaged in redressing some other fundamental issues, sources of the conflict, specifically the state institutions, being around Professor Richard here kind of always reminds you about the quality of the government, the state institutions in particular. Did the Carter administration do anything in terms of, putting in place state institutions that are capable to rule efficient as well as kind of, fair to all Liberian citizens?
So first question about the archives. Yeah, so we had archives from Professor Joseph, and we had some documents from the Carter Center as well. So that was including, yes, it was archives of correspondences from the time, as well as letters between people, so letters from President Carter to Charles Taylor, descriptions of those meetings. There's a pretty wide variety of what we had to look at.
So a lot of it was daily memorandum, right? Updates from the members of the Carter Center who were in the Liberia office in Monrovia. Correspondence, as Brandon said, between leaders of factions, leaders of countries, the UN, the United States government. Some outside reports that were written at the time and used to get a sense of the country. And sometimes handwritten notes from conferences, summaries of conferences, correspondence from people who were attending conferences about the conference. Just a lot of different angles on similar events. So it's like if you take the visit of Archbishop Tutu, there was the planning for that. There was the reaction of other people in Liberia towards that visit. There was how the visit went. It's a lot of really kind of day-by-day operational documentation of a large variety.
I'd say the most important or interesting documents there were the correspondences between these leaders of the warring parties that, I mean, I don't think that you're going to find that information elsewhere, that just really the nuts and bolts of trying to fight for that peace between the parties, distrust between him and this guy, and so the interactions between ECOMOG and the U.S. government and Jimmy Carter, that was the most, I'd say, interesting things, was the first-hand conversations between those people. And then for your second question, I think one theme of the Liberian Civil War was just the amount of destruction of what Liberia was before. That happens in every civil war. There was, you know, hundreds of thousands of people displaced. I think I'm getting the numbers right there. Yes.
Yeah.
And so there was a vacuum there where the Carter Center could come in and build those institutions that weren't there before. And I think the one very impactful thing in that vein was the building a civil society, particularly LNPD, because that was, a lot of these groups that attended these conferences were not all on, and that continued to be groups. I think there was the Akasambo group as well. They were not just one ethnic group. They were very diverse ethnic groups, and I think that worked towards sort of upending the precedent of these ethnic nationalizations, at least a little bit.
Yeah, so I'll give a short note. Of course, the immediate priority is ending the conflict in itself, and so there's not much you can do to strengthen really institutions of government before the conflict itself is over. But one institution that is very important is civil society, and the Carter Center did a lot to bring together groups that had emerged during the conflict but weren't really organized amongst each other. And that lasted through the conflict into the democratic period. And of course, once you have a democracy with elections and you can structure the government, much of that will be left to, of course, the people of Liberia. But the Carter Center, I believe, was providing advice, was still involved, even though they weren't, of course, making those institutions.
You go ahead. I just want to, and that's why I came up here so I could contribute to this conversation. Two things. First, another term that Alex has used, it has to do with what he called the complex tapestry of these developments in that country, because there is just so much going on, right? If you can imagine it, because you have these different warring groups. And you have, international actors of one sort or the other, and sometimes it could just be so baffling to even make sense of it. So there is this complex tapestry, which I think really captures it. But one of the things, I really must say, and here I want to give credit to Sam Forsgren, the other student who led the way, and the report that he made, even for somebody like myself, who was actually involved underground and was able to follow it, was very helpful in just kind of making more sense of what was going on, right? That process of doing so, which I think will continue with this project. The other thing I want to pick up is this question. I mean, Alex began to respond to it, when Sally asked about state institutions. And it is correct that, during this wartime period, what are you able to do, even in countries, as we well know, who are not facing this kind of war, the difficulty of those institutions. But a couple of things I want to say again about the Carter Center, and this happened incrementally, and sometimes in surprising ways. After Charles Taylor was elected, in 1997, and his election was really that the country was just tired of war, And if electing Charles Taylor to office was a means of getting out of the war, people were prepared to do it. But Charles Taylor remained Charles Taylor. And one of the programs that the Carter Center started during that period had to do with human rights, strengthening human rights. Now, if you could imagine, as you know, Charles Taylor is currently in The Hague, and for reasons that needs no explaining here. But that Charles Taylor in office was the same Charles Taylor. And so with the Carter Center getting involved with a human rights, trying to build up a human rights commission and do human rights work during that period, despite all of the challenges, you can see how this idea of, laying the seeds, for what could develop, later on down the road. But I would really, even at the time, I was no longer at the Carter Center, and I thought you're going to be working with Charles Taylor, on human rights issues. Even to myself, that seemed like in some ways, a somewhat contradictory kind of enterprise. But in fact, the Carter Center continued because Charles Taylor eventually, was driven out in the he didn't finish his term of office. And the Carter Center continued with other programs, right to information, obviously the work with the Electoral Commission, working with President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and so on. So if we look at, this engagement over that period of time, we can see ways in which you are, seeking to create sometimes rudiments of those institutions that had been, so, corroded during the war. But I don't think there was any conscious policy, but I think that a lot of, what has taken place, and of course we're able to speak with Tom Crick and others at the Carter Center who've been very much involved in it, you can really get a sense of that wider project that they've been engaged in.
So elaborating on the effect of dirty hands, so to speak, of Taylor too, how does that impact the way that the Carter Center went about trying to help establish this new governance? Because is it because of dirty hands, are we dissuaded from even involving ourselves with this leader? What if it's the only option, etc.?
Sure. Just one of the most interesting documents we had was this psychological profile of Charles Taylor, and it read like a villain in a movie.
Whose profile was that?
Might have been NDI's, maybe.
I think it was one of the American organizations.
Yeah, it said like cunning and like only does things if they're good for him.
Non-ideological.
Yes, no ideology. It was very interesting. It sounded like he was like some villain in like a book or something. And so I think from the beginning there was this understanding that dealing with Charles Taylor was a bit something that was difficult, right? There was a understanding that Charles Taylor was a personality that demanded some attention. And one thing that the Carter Center that they had to be the whole time was unbiased, and just the fact that Jimmy Carter continued to meet with Charles Taylor proved to be. Some people accused the Carter Center of bias because Charles Taylor continued to be a sort of thorn in the side of peace to some people. And so from the beginning, well, maybe not from the beginning, at one point or another, that came into play well before 1997.
Yeah, so the election that ended the first iteration of the Liberian Civil War brought to power Charles Taylor, and that election was really a vote for peace, right? To say, yes, I'm going to vote for Charles Taylor. He's clearly not a good person. He's probably not going to do very well for the country in the long term, but electing him to the presidency will end this conflict. Once he's in charge, he's the person you have to deal with, because he is the leader. And so, as Professor Joseph said, right, the Carter Center went in to work with him on human rights, right? And that might seem contradictory. It might be, so how can you work with this murderous warlord on human rights, but you work with what you're given, and it's better to do so than to do nothing at all. And so the bloody legacy of Charles Taylor is a complicated one, not in the sense that he's a complicated, not in the sense that it's unclear whether he's a good or bad person. He was very clearly a bad person, but in the sense of how do you work with that person to create good, given the facts that they are in control. And that's important. And of course, following the piece of the second piece, the lasting one, and Charles Taylor now, as Professor Joseph said, in The Hague, right? You get onto the idea of truth and reconciliation. How do we deal with this legacy of all this violence? And that's something that is, of course, ongoing, and that many countries have to deal with.
And if I may just add just a footnote to this set of remarks from Brandon and Alex, and this is a very important part of the Jimmy Carter legacy. I can tell you, those of us who work with him and work with him closely did not share the eagerness and zeal that he displayed towards some pretty I'm trying to think of an adjective that Carter will not frown at if I were to use it at this time, all right?
Questionable.
Very questionable, individuals. But a very important part of his legacy is that you have to talk to these people. And as we know, we're on the verge of our president, the President of the United States, actually getting ready to go and talk to the President Kim of North Korea. And Carter was the one who went to Korea in 1994 and met with the grandfather of the current president, and he was the one strongly urging Trump to go and actually speak, don't sit there hurling abuses and so on. All right. So this is a very important part of the legacy of Jimmy Carter, and it certainly played out in the Liberian context.